As the Warriors, Cavaliers, and Spurs headline the NBA playoffs, some close matches have made for spectacular viewing. But consider this: what if tackling were allowed in basketball? Don't laugh. Tackling was a very real possibility in basketball when the rules were first written about 100 years ago. It's one of the fascinating accounts in On the Origin of Sports, a new book co-authored by Gary Belsky, who joins us now to discuss. Gary, welcome. So great to have you here.
Great to be here, too.
So tackle basketball, that sounds like it would have been dangerous.
Yes, it would have been. You have to remember that basketball was invented literally over the course of a few days by James Naismith, who worked at a YMCA, and his boss said, you need to come up with a game that people can play indoors. This was in Massachusetts in the 1890s. And the dominant game in America at that time was college football. And college football involved a lot of tackling, so I think he was thinking like, well, you know, we might need some of that tackling stuff because people really seem to like that.
Got to bring it indoors. Now, you researched the origins of 21 sports, is that
Yes.
right? How did you choose these sports, and what did you find? Do they all have something in common?
Well, we actually researched more than 21 sports, but in order to get into our book, we wanted to be able to identify a set of rules that launched the modern game. So, for example, we have the rules of NASCAR because you can look at the first rules from the first season and say, okay, that's when NASCAR began, but you can never really find the original rules for Formula One racing. So in general, we were looking for an agreement by smart people, and sometimes we had to make the call, maybe not such smart people, but an agreement by most people and historians that from these rules, the modern form of this sport began.
Now, can you say that any sport was better than before it became a multi-million-dollar industry that it is today?
I don't know. I mean, I think certainly there were sports that had a little bit more of a carefree or free aspect to it. You know, at one point in baseball, you were allowed to, there were 4 outs in an inning, and you were allowed to throw the ball at batters, kind of like kickball later. But for the most part, I think sports have improved with codification, with athletes improving, with better equipment and better fields and more accurate officiating, things of that nature.
Right. And did you look at the origins of fantasy sports as well?
We did. In fact, our book has a scoop. You wouldn't think there'd be a scoop in a book about the history of sports, but fantasy sports as we know it began in 1980 with the invention of rotisserie baseball. That led to fantasy football, et cetera. But weirdly, there actually was a fantasy football league in the Bay Area in Oakland in the early 1960s, which people have come to know about recently, but nobody has ever seen those rules. But we actually got in touch with one of the last remaining members of the Greater Oakland Pigskin Predictors League. And he was a very nice man, and he gave us the rules. So in our book are rules that have never been seen before, which are the rules for the first fantasy football
Look
league.
at that. And it's so interesting to hear how so many sports, including golf, for instance, were rooted in a need to just combat boredom.
Yes.
I mean, is this something that goes on through the history of the human race?
Yeah, there's a little bit, there are a few themes that pervade all sports. One is people were bored and they needed something to do. Sometimes that involved shepherds in Scotland or China, by the way, where golf also had some origins, that didn't know what to do, so they took their shepherd staff and they started hitting rocks or petrified sheep dung at targets, and then men being men or shepherds being shepherds, they started competing with each other to see who could hit the sheep dung the farthest or the most accurately. But so boredom was a big effect. Also, just children, right? Children were often looking for sort of things to do, and adults were trying to give them ways to occupy themselves. There's also a lot of mentions in our book of animal bladders. And I know that seems like a funny idea, but basically back in the day, animals, when they were slaughtered, everything was used for clothing, for food, for shelter, but bladders in particular among the organs were something you couldn't eat and people didn't really know what to do with, but they were very good for stuffing with grass and kicking around.
There you go, making balls, footballs.
Exactly.
Were you able to identify the most ancient sport? Is it soccer out of China, or?
No, I would say without doubt the oldest references to sports and probably the oldest organized sports is wrestling. Remember, wrestling was a huge part of the original Olympics, and it shows up in lots of reliefs and artwork from 2 millennia before the birth of Christ.
And that's certainly a sport that used to be a lot more violent than
wrestling. Yes, when people used to wrestle or box, they were often wrestling or boxing for their life.
To the death, right?
Exactly.
All right, Gary Belsky, thank you so much for coming to see us.
My pleasure.